Good afternoon, everyone. Just love seeing the joy and anticipation when everyone realises it's the lawyer's turn to speak. And for those of you who aren't familiar with my firm, Ellison Lawyers, we are the largest commercial law firm in the Asia Pacific region, offices all over Asia, Oceania and London. We are very much a corporate independent practice. Our clients are Rio Tinto, Peabody Energy, Glencore, the big banks, the big financial institutions. We don't speak greenie. And in that context, I was very interested in the presentations yesterday afternoon around the theme of the way that the message on stranded assets is communicated. Because if any of you have had the misfortune to have to try and communicate a message to a company or to a board, sometimes the hard data, the logic, the reason just doesn't ever cut through if it's inconsistent with the beliefs and the values that the directors of the company hold. And I think it's very important that we play to the values of the corporate community when we are communicating the information around stranded assets. And so what I want to do is to recognise that the thing that is most important to a director, the thing that most focuses the mind of a director, is the spectre of personal liability. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, whether or not there is a credible prospect for individual directors to be held liable for their company's inaction on climate change or their investment funds in action on climate change. Now, here we go with the buttons. Nope. Nope.
Do the right-hand side of the circle.
So what I'm going to talk to you about is this thing called fiduciary duty. It's one of those lovely lawyery words that gets thrown around that no one really ever understands what it means. Fiduciary, it comes from the Latin fidere, which basically means faith and fidelity. And actually, fun fact for parties, it was originally used in a canonic law with the church, where the church was a fiduciary of the tithes that the parishioners gave to the church, and they were entrusted with it to be applied to the salvation of the soul of the parishioners who are donating the money. So this whole concept of fiduciary has grown out of a person being entrusted with the property or power that needs to be applied to the benefit of another. So that's essentially what a fiduciary is. And there are two core elements that go into that. The first is trust and loyalty. Because obviously, if you're the principal, the beneficiary, you need to have trust, and you need to know that your fiduciary is going to prioritise your interests in looking after your assets on your behalf. And the second half is competence. You need to have confidence that the fiduciary is going to do a half-decent job of looking after your assets for you. Now, in a legal sense, all the corporate governance laws and directors' duties laws, particularly in common law jurisdictions, all have their root in this concept of what a fiduciary is, whether it's under the Companies Act here in the UK, the Delaware General Corporations Law in the US, Corporations Act in Australia. So very conveniently for us, we can make broad sweeping generalisations about directors' duties laws and fiduciary laws, because they all, even though they differ at the margins, they all go back to these two concepts. So the trust and loyalty, that's given force in duties around good faith, acting in the best interests of the company, proper purposes, avoidance of conflicts. And in relation to the second half, competence, it's variations around the theme of prudence, due care and diligence. For us, if we're looking at a stranded assets climate change context, the question that we need to look at, the two questions we need to look at if we're interrogating whether or not directors can be in breach of their fiduciary duties by being inactive on climate change is, well, first of all, what are the best interests of the corporation that the directors need to prioritise, and is climate change consistent, action on climate change consistent with the best interests of the corporation? And the second element is, well, if climate change is consistent with the best interests of the corporation, what do the directors then need to do? What standard of conduct are they held to in order to discharge their duties? So taking each of those in turn, best interests. Now, you might be aware over the last 30 years or so there has been a significant economic debate around theories of CSR, or corporate social responsibility. And at their very basic level, the debate is around the extent to which directors can take non-financial interests into account when they are governing the corporation. And if you're interested in the literature on shareholder primacy versus stakeholder theory, I think Gordon, you did a very good survey of the literature on that last year. And historically in that literature, the environment has always been posited as a non-financial element. That is secondary to that primary aim of making money, and regard to it necessarily involves compromising return. But that conception has radically and rapidly evolved. And it's not the lawyers saying that that's changed in relation to climate change, that it's become a financial issue. You don't take financial advice from your lawyers. But the people who do know are saying that. HSBC, the World Bank, the Bank of England, Citibank, Mercer, Hermes, the list goes on. So the people who know are telling us that climate change is a financial issue that needs to be taken into account. So because of that, all the debates around, can we think about climate change? Can we not think about climate change? Because, our duty is to prioritise the financial interests of the firm. All of that is now becoming irrelevant. So we don't need to think about the penguins. We don't need to think about quality of life, community. All we need to think about is money, which is good for me, because lawyers don't like ethics. So we know that having regard to climate change, it's a financial issue, therefore it's in the best interests of the company to have regard to it. What do you then need to do as a director in relation to climate change? What is the standard of due care and diligence that you're held to? Now again, gross generalisation, but it actually holds true. All the different provisions in relation to due care and diligence across common law jurisdictions hold directors to the standard of a reasonable director. What would a reasonable director in these circumstances have done? Now, a few things to note about that. Increasingly higher standards of professionalism are expected of directors. Courts are no longer tolerant of sleeping governors. It's a profession. And directors are holding themselves out to be professionals and expert in governance, which is really risk management and strategy in a commercial context. The last thing to note there is reasonable does not mean average. Reasonable, particularly in a litigious context when you are testing whether or not a director has acted reasonably, almost becomes best practice, because a prosecutor can always point to something that someone else has done and ask, well, why didn't you do that? Now, before I talk about the 4Es, the leading case on this, which is fun to talk about, is a case called Centro. What happened in Centro? Centro is a listed retail property trust, changed its name several times since, very highly leveraged. And you might remember in the lead up to the GFC, that was a problem if you were very highly leveraged, because credit was becoming a lot harder to come by, and they were having great difficulty in refinancing their debt on terms that were comparable to their existing debt portfolio. So the board was spending a lot of time looking at the maturity profile of their debt portfolio. Every board meeting they'd be considering this. As it turns out, the annual report for Centro that the directors signed off on misqualified $1.5 billion worth of current liabilities as non-current, and also failed to disclose another lazy $500 million worth of post-balance date guarantees that should have been disclosed in the annual reports. So the annual reports were misleading or deceptive. Now, in their defence, the directors said internal audit signed off on this, external audit signed off on this, and not just, you know, auditors are us down on the high street, PwC signed off on this. We're not expert accountants. You can't hold, how can you hold us liable for something that the experts didn't pick up on? And the court said, no, you breached your duty of due care and diligence by signing off on those misleading accounts. Blind Freddie could have picked up on that mistake. But the reason that none of you did is because you didn't read the financial statements. And if you had read the financial statements, you should have asked the question of the experts. Why has this been classified in this way when it's inconsistent with, you know, what we've been looking at over the past year about maturity profile of our debt portfolio? So from the Prsenter case, we can divine the 4 E's of due care and diligence. And this is Sarah's 4 E's of due care and diligence. The court will never come out with a nice little list of 4 E's or 3 P's or anything like that, because that would be too easy. But I find it quite useful to think of it in the 4 E's. So this is what a director needs to do to satisfy their duty of due care and diligence. The first E is educate. They need to continuously educate themselves about issues that are relevant to the operation of their business, what the business does, what the economic pressures and industrial pressures are that impact on the performance of the business, what its financial position is, what its regulatory environment is. How much knowledge do they need? How much is enough? Do they need to be experts? The answer is no, which leads me to my next E, which is inquire. They need to know enough to know what they don't know. So this is, Donald Rumsfeld was right, the known unknowns. They need to have the alarm bell knowledge of what issues are relevant to the operation of their company so that they can ask the experts who do know. There's that positive obligation. If they're not getting that information from management, they need to ask. They then need to examine the information that's put before them, interrogate the information that's put before them, and critically evaluate it. Exercise their independent judgment. So you can see that there is this proactivity and engagement that is now required of directors in order to satisfy this duty of due care and diligence. And one thing to note there as well is that all of those factors, those 4 E's, they're process factors. The law doesn't care about the actual decision a board makes. It only cares that that decision was arrived at on the basis of a robust process. And the importance of that point in relation to climate change is going to become clear. So,
5 minutes.
5 minutes left.
Yeah.
So, plugging all that back into our fiduciary equation, we can see that directors have a fiduciary duty to proactively and critically evaluate material financial risks associated with climate change. And you will notice something very unusual about that statement, which is it's an unequivocal statement from a lawyer. And having done the analysis, I am happy to stand behind that statement. So, what we can see is the common reasons for inaction in relation to climate change are likely to breach a duty of due care and diligence. If you're a denialist or a skeptic, even if that belief is genuinely held, if you have educated yourself, if you have done the reading and yet still hold that denialist position, you would also know that that position differs from 95-98% of market stakeholders, your insurers, your financiers, your customers, your suppliers, and that brings stakeholder risks that you need to act on and manage. Honest ignorance, unreflective assumption, again, you haven't educated yourself properly, Or uncertainty and complexity paralysis. So if you're saying, oh, this climate change thing, I know it's real, but it's all too hard. We'll look at it in 10 years when, we work out what's going on. Not an excuse. Doing nothing is taking a position. And yes, it's hard, and yes, it's complex, but that doesn't absolve a board from responsibility for managing that risk and that uncertainty. That's what they're there to do. You can't just benchmark yourself to what everyone else in your industry is doing, because that's not actively managing the risk to your company, nor regulatory compliance. Just merely complying with the law is not wealth maximising or profit maximising. And you also need to make sure that the methodology and the data that you apply in considering the issue is up to date and fit for purpose. Very quickly, because this is where as my superannuation partner says, this is where this shit gets real. There have been now a couple of prosecutions in the US where this issue around breach of duty is crystallising in the pensions industry. So there have been 2 proceedings against the fiduciaries, the trustees of the Arch Coal and Peabody Energy employee share plans, seeking compensation where the employees have seen the value of their pension fall by 96%, just a lazy 96% over the 3-year claim period, as their pension money has been invested in company stock. So the employees are saying, well, trustees, you as individuals have breached your duty of due care and diligence, duty of prudence in the US, because of the fact that you didn't turn your mind to whether or not the investment in company stock continued to be a prudent investment for our retirement savings. You didn't consider the structural decline in coal, and then you didn't consider the impact on the company, the economic impacts on the company in terms of Z scores, which is an indicator of bankruptcy going through the floor, increased debt to equity ratio, downgrades from the credit agencies, mine closures, revenue projections falling, all this kind of thing. So all these economic indicators weren't considered by the trustees, it's alleged. Now, these cases to me are very significant for 2 reasons. First of all, they don't talk about environmentalism, climate change at all. The words actually aren't mentioned anywhere in the claims. And to me that's very significant because it demonstrates how climate change and stranded asset issues really are financial issues and can be dealt with as purely economic financial issues without having to get into the ethics of it. But there's certainly no doubt that some of the drivers that it's alleged the fiduciaries have missed are driven by climate change. Sure, the fall off in demand from China, which has created the dive in the coal price. Obviously, that's related to factors more than climate change. Slowdown in the Chinese economy. A lot of the coal companies are locked into take or pay transport contracts, which means that they're incentivised to keep their supply up. But other factors like the increased competition from renewables, like emissions, tightening of emissions regulation and pollution controls on mines, are other factors that are referred to in the claim that really demonstrate that climate change is the driver behind this. And the second reason I feel it's significant is because it's related to the process that the fiduciaries applied and not the outcome. It's not alleged that they breached their duty because the value of the pension fell by 90%. It's alleged they breached their duty because they didn't turn their mind to the issue. It's a matter of process rather than outcome.